The woman walked into the courtroom in Escambia County, Florida, with a tense and unreadable expression. In front of her was not an ordinary charge, and it was not a case where she could easily say she was only standing on the outside. She was a mother, but this time, that mother was not on trial for personally facing the victim. She was on trial for what prosecutors said
She didn't call 911. She didn't get Brooklyn out of that store. She didn't get her out of harm's way. She didn't take her somewhere. Lock her in the back somewhere. Get her out of there. She did nothing. She didn't even put Brooklyn on notice, excuse me.
The story Sheila Agee wanted the world to see was not a story of a calculated plan. It was wrapped in the appearance of chaos, anger, toxic messages, and a son she said she could not control. If that was all someone heard, some people might think this was a mother caught up in her son's anger, a woman who had said cruel things in a moment of tension, a wrongful, toxic family conversation, but not necessarily enough to make her part of a crime. But then the messages came out, and from that moment, the story Sheila wanted to build began to collapse. On the 11th of August 2023, Brooklyn Sims, and one 8-year-old girl, was working inside the Home Depot on Davis Highway in Pensacola, Florida. It should have been just a normal work shift, a normal day. A normal store, where customers came and went, employees did their jobs, and no one thought that only minutes later, that place would become the center of a case that would make all of Florida pay attention. Brooklyn was not a stranger to the Agee family. She was the mother of Keith Agee's young daughter. And that connection was exactly what made this case so much more heartbreaking. According to prosecutors, Keith Agee drove from Alabama to Pensacola that day, but they did not see it as a random trip, not a chance meeting, not a burst of anger completely separate from what had happened before. Because before Keith walked into Home Depot, his phone and his mother's phone had left behind a chain of evidence. Those messages did not just show anger, they showed encouragement, they showed coordination. And according to prosecutors, they showed a mother who did not pull her son away from his hatred, but was instead accused of pushing that hatred closer to Brooklyn. In the hours before the tragedy happened, Sheila Agee was not just a mother listening to her son complain. Prosecutors said she knew Keith was headed toward Home Depot, knew Brooklyn was there, and instead of trying to stop everything, she became part of the chain of actions that led to an irreversible moment. When Keith Agee walked into the store, Brooklyn was still in the middle of her work shift. She did not know that the messages between mother and son had turned her into the target of an anger she no longer had a chance to escape. In just a few minutes, the Home Depot on Davis Highway was no longer a normal workplace. Customers panicked, employees tried to get away from the area, and Brooklyn Sims, and one 8-year-old girl who had only just begun her life as a mother, no longer had the chance to return to her young daughter. What you are about to watch is not an ordinary family crime case. This is the story of a mother who did not directly act, but was still found by a jury to be part of the crime. This is the story of messages that seemed to exist only inside a phone, but eventually became evidence that made the entire courtroom look at Sheila Agee in a completely different way. And every detail you are watching has been verified through investigative records, phone evidence, testimony in court, statements from authorities, and the sentence handed down in Florida. This is a case that shook Pensacola, not only because Brooklyn Sims was so young, not only because she was the mother of a small child, but also because of the chilling question behind it. How far can a mother go when she chooses to stand with her son's anger, even when her words can lead to irreversible consequences? If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself. Because what happened at the Home Depot on Davis Highway in Pensacola on the 11th of August 2023 will force you to question motherhood, blind loyalty, hatred, and the terrifying line between words spoken in anger and legal responsibility. To understand why Sheila Agee eventually had to stand before the court, be convicted of principal to first-degree premeditated murder, and receive a life sentence without parole, we have to go back to before Keith Agee walked into Home Depot, before Brooklyn Sims began her final work shift, before the messages between mother and son became evidence before the jury, and before an 8-year-old girl, a young mother, became the center of one of the most haunting revenge cases in Florida in recent years. Brooklyn Sims was only 18 years old when her name became tied to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Pensacola, Florida. She was a young mother, raising a small daughter she shared with Keith Agee. Her life was still at the beginning, but by August 2023, The relationship around that child had already become strained, painful, and dangerous. Keith Agee was the child's father. Sheila Agee was Keith's mother, and through that connection, she was also tied to Brooklyn, not only as the child's grandmother, but as someone who worked near her and knew her personally. Brooklyn and Sheila were both connected to the same workplace. They worked as contract employees at the Home Depot on Davis Highway in Pensacola. That detail became deeply important later, because on the 11th of August 2023, Brooklyn did not arrive at that store with a stranger. According to investigators, Sheila was the person who gave Brooklyn a ride to work that day. In the ordinary rhythm of a workday, that might have seemed like a simple act of convenience, but by the time investigators reviewed the messages between Sheila and Keith, that ride became part of a much darker timeline. Before Brooklyn arrived at Home Depot, Keith Agee was in Alabama. At his own trial, he later said he had received a medical test result involving an intimate health condition and believed Brooklyn was connected to it. He claimed this was what pushed his anger forward, but prosecutors would later challenge that claim, and after Keith's conviction, they presented evidence showing Brooklyn had already provided information suggesting she was not responsible for what Keith believed. In court, that detail mattered because it showed how quickly accusation, anger, and blame had turned into something irreversible. On the morning of the 11th of August 2023, Keith left Alabama. According to testimony and public reporting, he left work, went home, got a firearm, and drove roughly 90 minutes toward Pensacola. His destination was not random. It was the Home Depot on Davis Highway, where Brooklyn was working. While Keith was making that drive, prosecutors said he was also communicating with his mother, Sheila. Those messages would later become the center of the case against her. Investigators said the messages showed more than a mother hearing her son make angry statements. Authorities said Sheila knew Keith was headed toward Brooklyn and helped coordinate his movements. Some of the messages, later discussed in court and reported by news outlets, showed Sheila giving directions, sending a map of the store, and making statements that prosecutors described as encouragement. She also warned Keith not to harm her car. To prosecutors, that detail was not small. It suggested that Sheila understood Keith was capable of using the firearm and that she was concerned about where it might happen. The state's case against Sheila would later depend on a specific legal point. Prosecutors did not argue that Sheila was the person who entered the store and used the weapon. Keith was the direct actor. But under Florida law, a person can be held responsible as a principal if they help, encourage, assist, or coordinate the crime. That was the theory prosecutors used. They argued Sheila's words, her messages, her actions at the store, and her failure to warn Brooklyn in a meaningful way helped put Keith in the position to reach Brooklyn. Inside the Home Depot that day, Brooklyn was doing her job. She was in the store as a contract employee, working in an aisle, unaware that the day was moving toward a confrontation. Customers and employees were moving through the building. For everyone else, it was a normal retail afternoon. But outside that ordinary setting, Keith had driven across state lines and was approaching the store. Surveillance footage and witness testimony later helped investigators trace Keith's movements. He arrived in Pensacola, parked near the area where Sheila's car was located, and entered the Home Depot through the front of the store. He did not wander aimlessly. Prosecutors said he moved toward the area where Brooklyn was working, identified in trial coverage as aisle 52. Sheila, meanwhile, was also captured on surveillance moving through parts of the store and using her phone. Prosecutors later argued that her movements and phone use were consistent with coordination. The defense disputed that interpretation, saying Sheila was not trying to help Keith, but the video became one of the pieces jurors had to weigh. When Keith reached Brooklyn, witnesses later described a brief confrontation. One witness testified that Keith said words suggesting he believed Brooklyn had given him something connected to his medical concern. Then the encounter turned fatal. Keith opened fire in the aisle, striking Brooklyn multiple times. She collapsed inside the store and died at the scene. The sudden violence shattered the normal noise of a workday. Employees and shoppers reacted in fear, trying to leave the area or find somewhere safe as emergency calls began coming in. The 911 record in this case is important, but it must be described carefully. Public trial reporting does not identify one single person as the first caller. Instead, there were several 911 calls from inside or around the Home Depot shortly after the shooting. At Sheila Agee's trial, records testimony showed that calls came in around 1:21 p.m. and 1:22 p.m. Those callers reported an emergency inside the store, and law enforcement responded quickly. For a script, the safest and most accurate way to say it is that several 911 calls came in almost immediately, but no public source identifies one single first caller by name. Deputies and first responders arrived to a chaotic store. Early information treated the situation as an active threat inside a public business. People were moving out of the building. Others had hidden or taken cover. Law enforcement entered, secured the area, and located Brooklyn in the aisle where the shooting had occurred. Deputy Sam Shelley, who later testified, described arriving and encountering a scene where people were trying to get away from danger. The aisle became a crime scene, and officers began the careful work of separating witnesses, preserving evidence, and determining whether the person responsible was still inside the store. Keith had already left the Home Depot. He was not arrested inside the aisle or at the immediate scene. After leaving, he later contacted law enforcement himself. Reports state that he was arrested a short time later outside the Mellow Mushroom on Bayou Boulevard after calling police. That call helped bring the immediate search for the shooter to an end, but it did not end the investigation. In many ways, the investigation was only beginning. Once Keith was in custody, investigators began building the case around three major questions. First, what exactly happened inside Home Depot? Second, why had Keith driven from Alabama to Pensacola with a firearm? Third, did anyone help him or encourage him before he arrived? The first question was answered through witnesses, surveillance footage, emergency records, and physical evidence. Investigators could place Brooklyn in the store, place Keith entering the store, and track his path toward the aisle. They could also confirm the timing of the 911 calls, the law enforcement response, and the location where Brooklyn died. The second question came through Keith's later testimony and the evidence around his drive from Alabama. He admitted that he left work, went home, got the firearm, and drove about 90 minutes to Home Depot. The third question became the reason Sheila Agee's role came under intense scrutiny. Investigators searched the phones and found messages between Sheila and Keith. Some messages had been deleted, but law enforcement recovered enough to form a theory that Sheila was not merely aware of Keith's anger. Authorities said she had helped direct it. Sheriff's officials publicly described the messages as showing that Sheila helped coordinate the killing. Prosecutors later took that argument into court. In the messages, Sheila was accused of encouraging Keith rather than stopping him. She allegedly sent information about the store and communicated with him as he traveled. She warned him not to shoot at her car. Prosecutors said she told him to wait until she put Brooklyn out, meaning until Brooklyn was no longer in the vehicle. To the state, those words showed knowledge, timing, and participation. They were not treated as empty anger or loose talk. They became evidence of planning. Sheila was later arrested in Alabama. A detail that drew strong public attention was that before her arrest, she attended a balloon release held in Brooklyn's memory. To the public, that image was difficult to process. The woman accused of helping arrange the fatal encounter had appeared at an event mourning the victim. Authorities arrested Sheila afterward, and she was charged as a principal to first-degree premeditated murder. Keith's case went to trial first. In December 2023, a jury heard the evidence against him. His defense centered on the idea that he had not gone to Home Depot with a clear original plan to take Brooklyn's life. He testified about the medical test result, his anger, and his belief that Brooklyn was responsible. He admitted important actions: leaving work, getting a firearm, driving from Alabama to Florida, entering Home Depot, and confronting Brooklyn. But he tried to frame the final act as something driven by emotion in the moment rather than premeditation. The jury did not accept that argument. The timeline worked against him. He had time to leave work, time to go home, time to get the weapon, time to drive across state lines, and time to enter the store and find Brooklyn. For prosecutors, each step showed the ability to stop, turn around, call someone, or make a different decision. Instead, Keith continued until he found Brooklyn at work. The jury found him guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. After the verdict, Keith Agee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court treated the case as a deliberate act, not a sudden accident or a misunderstood confrontation. Brooklyn's life had ended in a public store where she had simply gone to work, and the person convicted was the father of her child. But Keith's conviction did not close the case. Sheila's trial remained. Her first trial took place in November 2024, and prosecutors presented the theory that she had helped her son commit the crime through messages, directions, and encouragement. But that first trial ended without a final verdict. The judge declared a mistrial after serious concerns arose involving the jury. Public reporting described issues inside the jury process, including a juror doing crossword puzzles during proceedings and deliberations, along with other problems raised by jurors. The court accepted the defense motion, and Sheila's case had to be tried again. The mistrial delayed the legal outcome, but it did not weaken the prosecution's decision to try again. In August 2025, Sheila Agee returned to court for her retrial. This time, the state again focused on the messages, the surveillance footage, the recovered phone data, witness testimony, and the overall timeline. Prosecutors told jurors that Sheila did not have to pull the trigger to be legally responsible. If she encouraged, assisted, or helped Keith reach Brooklyn, she could be guilty as a principal. The prosecution described Sheila's role as active. They said she was not a frightened bystander. She had worked with Brooklyn. She had given Brooklyn a ride to Home Depot. She was in communication with Keith before the shooting. She sent information. She used her phone repeatedly inside the store. She did not call police in time to stop her son. She did not clearly warn Brooklyn in a way that could save her, and when the messages were examined together, prosecutors argued they showed support for Keith's plan, not an effort to prevent it. Sheila's defense argued the opposite. Her attorney said the messages were being misread and pulled out of context. The defense portrayed Sheila as a mother dealing with a volatile son, not a person who wanted Brooklyn harmed. They argued that her language with Keith was harsh and emotional, but not criminal coordination. They said Sheila had a relationship with Brooklyn, had helped her, and had a connection through the child Brooklyn shared with Keith. Sheila herself testified that she did not want Brooklyn dead and said that, if she could, she would trade places with her. The defense also suggested that Sheila's behavior inside the store could be interpreted differently. Where prosecutors saw surveillance footage of a woman watching, coordinating, and using her phone, the defense suggested she may have been anxious, unsure what Keith would do, or trying to manage a dangerous situation. But the prosecution returned to the texts. Words sent before a crime, they argued, reveal intent more clearly than explanations given after the fact. During closing arguments, the prosecution drew a line between speech and action. They argued that Sheila's messages were not just words floating in anger. They were paired with real-world conduct, bringing Brooklyn to the location, communicating with Keith as he traveled, sending store information, and failing to stop the chain of events. In the state's view, those facts made her part of the crime. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 hours and 45 minutes. Then they found Sheila Agee guilty of principal to first-degree premeditated murder. The verdict meant jurors accepted the prosecution's theory that she had played a criminal role in Brooklyn's death, even though Keith was the person who directly used the weapon. After the verdict, Sheila was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was mandatory for the conviction. Before sentencing, Brooklyn's mother spoke in court about the damage left behind. She addressed not only Brooklyn's loss, but also the little girl who would grow up without her mother, while her father and grandmother were both serving life sentences connected to the same case. Sheila also spoke, saying she had failed Brooklyn, her granddaughter Keith, and others. But the court's decision was final. Like Keith, Sheila would spend the rest of her life in prison unless a future court changed the outcome. The current status of the case is clear. Keith Agee was convicted in December 2023 of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to life without parole. Sheila Agee's first trial ended in a mistrial in 2024, but after the retrial in August 2025, she was convicted as a principal to first-degree premeditated murder and also received life without parole. The legal system held both the direct actor and the alleged coordinator responsible. Brooklyn Sims was 18 years old, a young mother at work, when her life was taken inside a Home Depot aisle. The case stands out not only because of where it happened, but because of the people involved. The man convicted of killing her was the father of her child. The woman convicted of helping him was that child's grandmother. What began as anger, blame, and messages between a mother and son ended with 2 life sentences and a child left to grow up with the full weight of what happened in that store. The strongest message from the Brooklyn Sims case is that words can become part of a crime when they encourage, direct, or help violence move from anger into action. Keith Agee was the person who entered Home Depot and ended Brooklyn's life, but the jury also found that Sheila Agee's role mattered. Her messages, her presence, and her failure to protect Brooklyn turned a family conflict into a coordinated criminal act. The lesson is that no relationship, when threats become specific, when a weapon is involved, and when someone begins moving toward a victim, silence is not neutral. It can become permission. Brooklyn was 18, a young mother at work, when the people connected to her child became the people convicted in her death. The court delivered life sentences, but the damage reached far beyond the courtroom. Her daughter was left to grow up without her mother, while both her father and grandmother were sent to prison for life. This case stands as a warning. Anger must be stopped before it becomes a plan, and a plan before it becomes permanent loss for everyone involved.